The ocean took me at 4:47 in the afternoon, and the last thing I saw before the boat disappeared into the horizon was the back of Day's head. Not his face. Not his eyes. Just the back of his head, like I had never mattered enough to be worth a final look. I kept swimming after the boat until my arms stopped being arms and became something else. Burning, useless things attached to a body that was rapidly forgetting why it was fighting. I could still see the vessel in the distance, just barely, a white smudge against the bruising sky, and I kept telling myself, they'll turn around. They'll realize. Someone will count heads and they'll turn the boat around. The smudge shrank. The smudge disappeared. And for a long time I just treaded water in the middle of the open ocean and waited for the part where this stopped being real. The trip had been Day's idea. A sailing weekend with a few of his friends from his old university days, people I knew by name and liked well enough but had never fully cracked open. A charter boat, fully crewed, the kind of thing that costs more than I made in a month but Day had assured me was handled. I hadn't asked how or by whom because I was trying to be the kind of person who didn't ask those questions, who trusted. I was very good at trusting. We had been together for 2 years and 4 months. I know the months because I'm that kind of person. I had been falling in love with Day slowly and then all at once and then continuously, in that sustained way that feels less like falling and more like a choice you keep making every morning. I thought he was doing the same thing. I thought we were building something. The afternoon swim had been spontaneous, or I had believed it was. Someone suggested it, the water was warm, 3 of us went in. Day had hesitated on the ladder, which I now understand differently, but at the time I took his hand and said come on and he slid into the water beside me and he was laughing. He was laughing. I need you to understand that part. He was laughing while he was deciding to leave me there. We swam out a distance from the boat, not reckless, not dangerously far, just enough to feel the size of the ocean around us. The other 2 stayed closer to the ladder. Day and I drifted a little. He was telling me some story about his second year at university, this memory he'd had surface earlier in the day, and I was half listening and half watching the way the light hit the water and thinking about how I'd render this in an illustration, what colors I'd use. Then he said, I need to check on something. And he turned back toward the boat. I watched him go. I wasn't alarmed. Why would I be alarmed? People swim back. I floated on my back and looked at the sky and waited for him to do whatever he needed to do and come back. The engine started. The sound of it arrowed straight through me. I righted myself in the water and the boat was moving. Not dramatically, not a sudden lurch, just the quiet, deliberate gathering of speed that boats do when they are going somewhere. I called out. I waved. The other 2 people who'd been in the water were already on the ladder, already climbing back up. I screamed Day's name. He appeared at the railing, briefly just for a moment, and looked at me. He actually looked at me. And then he turned away, said something to one of the crew, and that was it. That was the last time I saw his face. The swimming that came after is harder to tell cleanly because it happened in pieces, in stages of denial. First I swam hard after the boat because they would turn around. Then I swam slower because I needed to conserve energy for when I reached shore. Then I swam in no particular direction because I had stopped believing in destinations. The sun went down. The ocean, which had been warm and blue and gorgeous all day, became something else entirely in the dark. Vast and indifferent and permanent in a way that I, treading water in the center of it, was very clearly not. I thought about Day's face. I thought we seemed happy. Not performed happy, not let's take a photo happy. Actually happy. I thought about a Wednesday 3 weeks ago when we'd cooked badly together and laughed until we were on the kitchen floor, and I could not locate anywhere in that memory the person who would look at me from a boat railing and turn away. The cold got into my bones. My legs became heavy, then heavier, then theoretical. The last coherent thought I had was not desperate or dramatic. It was just, I don't understand. Simple as that. A question I would not survive to have answered, hovering there in the dark water, just, I don't understand. And then I went under and there was nothing. Chapter 2, Firelight and Closed Doors. I came back to consciousness like something being dragged, slow and reluctant and confused about the direction. The ceiling was wooden. The air smelled of pine resin and something cooking, something that involved garlic and warmth and the particular promise of salt. Firelight moved on the walls. My entire body was a catalog of pain, throat raw, lungs tender in a way that made every breath feel like an apology, fingers stiff, arms like they'd been disassembled and poorly reassembled. I turned my head. A man sat with his back to me at a fire that occupied the far end of the single-room cabin, stirring something in a cast iron pot with the unhurried ease of someone who had done this exact thing 1,000 times before. He was large, not in an ostentatious way but in the way of someone who simply occupied more space than the average person, broad shoulders and height and a quiet solidity that made the cabin feel simultaneously smaller and safer. Dark hair. Full beard. Dressed like he'd never heard of a city. He hadn't noticed I was awake yet. Or maybe he had and was giving me time. I couldn't tell and I wasn't sure which option unsettled me more. I tried to sit up. The noise I made was undignified. He turned. His face gave nothing away, not alarm, not warmth, not anything I could name. He just looked at me with dark, unhurried eyes like I was a weather pattern he was deciding how to interpret, and then he said, "You should eat first. Not how are you or who are you or I found you in the ocean and that's extremely alarming. Just, eat first." As if everything else could wait until I had been fed. I ate. He set a bowl in front of me and sat on the other side of the rough wooden table and ate his own portion and we said almost nothing, and it was the strangest meal of my life and also, objectively, the best thing I had tasted in recent memory. Some kind of fish stew. I ate all of it and would have been embarrassed about that except my body had bypassed embarrassment entirely and was operating purely on survival instinct. "Where am I?" I finally asked. "Safe," he said. "That's not." It's the most relevant answer to the question you're actually asking. He gathered the bowls without looking at me. "You can ask the geographic version tomorrow, when you're not about to fall asleep at my table." He was right. I was about to fall asleep at his table. The next 3 days were strange in ways I'm still sorting through. He told me his name was Kale, offered it flat and simply with no last name attached, and that was approximately the sum total of personal information I extracted from him in the first week. Everything else was deflection, not hostile deflection, but the practiced kind, the kind that had been refined over time into something almost graceful. He would answer questions about the cabin, about the fish in the nearby waters, about the best way to treat the saltwater abrasions on my palms. He would not answer questions about himself. He left for hours at a time and I didn't know where he went. He always came back. The cabin was far from anything. That much I could determine. A long stretch of beach in both directions, visible through the single wide window with no structures in sight. Behind the cabin, dense tree cover climbed a ridge. There was no phone. No visible technology beyond a small hand-cranked radio that crackled weather reports and nothing else. Whatever this place was, it existed at a careful distance from everything else. I noticed things about him in those first days in spite of myself. The way he moved, quiet and unhurried, never wasted motion. The way he tended to the fire like it was a living thing that needed consistency to trust you. The way he occasionally forgot to maintain his blankness when something caught him off guard. A bird outside the window that was doing something unexpected, a sentence I said that landed differently than I intended, and something unguarded and almost luminous would cross his face before he brought the shutters back down. On the fourth evening I was well enough to sit outside and he sat near me on the steps and we watched the ocean go dark together and he said, unprompted, "The tides here are unusual. They pull westward after sundown. It's why things end up on this beach that weren't headed here." I looked at him. He was looking at the water. "Is that how you found me?" "Partially." A beat. "Partially I was already outside." I wanted to ask why he was already outside, what had pulled him out at that hour, but something in the line of his jaw told me we had reached the edge of what he would give tonight, and I had started to learn the geography of his silences. It was on the 6th night that I actually told him. We had developed a routine by then. Dinner, the fire, the particular silence that existed between us that was less uncomfortable than it probably should have been. He asked me that night how I had ended up in the water. Not intrusively. More the way someone asks a question they've been carrying around for days and have finally decided to set down. So I told him. All of it. The morning, the swim, the engine, the boat growing small on the horizon. The screaming. The hours of swimming. The dark. I told it plainly because I was too tired to tell it dramatically, and somewhere in the middle of it my voice did something involuntary and I had to stop and look at the ceiling for a moment and breathe through my nose. He didn't fill the silence. He just waited. "The worst part," I said finally, "isn't that I almost died." "What's the worst part?" "That we were happy." The words came out quiet and wrecked. Or I thought we were. I've been going back through everything, looking for the part where I missed something, looking for the moment where I should have known, and I can't find it. We were happy. I was sure of it. And I don't understand how a person does that. How a person stands next to someone I stopped. I don't understand. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, people show you who they are. Sometimes it just takes a boat. It was both the least helpful and the most comforting thing anyone had ever said to me. I laughed. It was a broken, saltwater sort of laugh, but it was real. And he looked at me when I laughed, that unguarded thing happening in his face again, and then he looked away. Go to sleep, he said. You're still recovering. I went to sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about Day's smile in the morning light and tried to decide if I was angrier at him or at myself for not having some animal instinct that should have screamed wrong, wrong, wrong when there was still time to run. I thought about Kale's face when I laughed. I thought, I don't know anything about this person. Why does that feel less frightening every day? Chapter 3, The Shape of What He Won't Say. By the second week, I had developed a theory about Kale. He was hiding from something. Not the dramatic action movie kind of hiding. No looking over his shoulder, no locked rooms I wasn't allowed in. It was quieter than that. It was the hiding of someone who had decided, at some specific point, that the world had shown him enough of itself and he was finished engaging with the exhibit. The clues were subtle and I had time to notice them because I had nothing to do except heal and observe and fight the particular boredom of having no phone, no work, no designs to finish and no notifications pulling at my attention like small needy hands. It turned out the absence of distraction left you alone with your thoughts in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood, and my thoughts kept drifting, annoyingly repeatedly, in Kale's direction. He knew things that didn't belong to a man who had always lived on a beach. When I mentioned offhandedly that my laptop at home had been giving me memory issues, he diagnosed the likely problem in 2 sentences with the casual specificity of someone who had once sat in meetings about such things. When a storm came in on the 9th day and I helped him reinforce the cabin's storm shutters, he guided me through it using vocabulary that belonged to engineering rather than carpentry. Small things. The wrong vocabulary for a hermit. And then there was the cabin itself, which was simple, yes, and spare, but the simplicity had been designed. The wood was expensive. The cast iron was the kind that cost more than people thought cast iron could cost. The mattress in the sleeping loft was the kind that held your spine like it cared about your spine. None of this was the habitat of someone with nothing. It was the habitat of someone who had decided to live as if they had nothing, which was a very different and far more telling thing. I didn't push. This was partly instinct and partly something else, something I was only beginning to name, which was that I liked the time it took to learn him. I was used to people being legible immediately, today who had been charming and open and offered himself up completely in the first week, and look how that had turned out. Kale's resistance felt less like withholding and more like, weight. Like the things he held close had gravity. What I could see was this: he was happy. Not performed happy. Not social happy. The particular private happiness of someone doing exactly what they want in the place they want to do it, and the equally particular surprise of that happiness when someone else stepped into it. He would come in from his morning walks and find me attempting something ambitious with the limited kitchen supplies, and his face would do the thing, the open, uncomplicated, almost young thing, before he could catch it. He laughed easily once I'd cracked the first laugh out of him, which had taken 6 days and a spectacular failure on my part to correctly estimate how long fish needed to cook. After that the laughter came more regularly, and it was startling every time because it transformed him, not into someone else but into a fuller version of himself, like watching something bloom that had been balled up tight for protection. We fished in the mornings. This had been his suggestion and I'd been skeptical, and it turned out I was terrible at fishing in ways that delighted him disproportionately. "You're doing it wrong again," he said on what I believe was the 4th consecutive morning I dropped the line. "I know I'm doing it wrong," I said. "I am doing it wrong in a consistent and committed way that should be receiving more respect than it is." He made a sound, this low, helpless sound, and pressed his hand over his mouth, and his shoulders shook, and I felt, sitting there in the morning sun with my dropped fishing line floating uselessly on the water, something warm and complicated bloom open in my chest. I looked away. The fish were smarter than me. That was fine. On the 15th day I asked him directly. We were sitting with dinner, evening settling around the cabin, and I had simply run out of patience for circling it. "What happened to you before this?" The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, he didn't flinch or freeze, but the door behind his eyes closed. I watched it happen. One moment he was present and warm and here, and then something reached up from inside him and pulled him several steps back behind his own face. "It's not a story I tell," he said. "Can I ask why?" "Because it doesn't end anywhere useful." He moved to clear the table. "Because the telling of it doesn't change any part of it." "Because," he stopped, set the bowls back down, stood at the table with his hands flat on the wood and looked at the window, and whatever he saw out there was in the past, not on the beach. "Because some things are cleaner when they stay where you left them." I watched him. "What you went through," he said eventually, still looking at the window. With Day." He said the name like it was a word in a language he'd had to learn. "You want to understand it? You're going through it looking for the logic." "Yes. I know that feeling." He finally looked at me. "And I want to tell you it helps, finding the logic. But I'm not sure it does. I think sometimes things are just what they are. And the understanding doesn't make them lighter." It was the most he'd ever said at once about anything interior. I didn't push further. I stored it and I sat with it, and later, in the sleeping loft, I turned it over carefully the way you turn over something fragile, trying to feel its shape in the dark. Someone did something to him. That was what I thought. Someone left him somewhere, metaphorically or literally, and he came here so it couldn't reach him. And I had been dropped on his beach by his own ocean. I wonder if he'd thought about that. Chapter 4. What the morning cost him. The conversation happened on a Tuesday, I think. Time had gone soft and uncertain on that beach, days blurring at their edges, and I had been awake since before the light, sitting with it, turning the decision over. I had to go home. It was not a realization so much as an arrival. It had been building for days, the accumulating weight of all the things I had left behind. My work, half-finished projects, and a client who had been waiting 3 weeks for revisions and had no idea why I had disappeared. My sister, who had probably filed some kind of report. My apartment, which would be silently accumulating dust and unread mail, and the particular sadness of spaces that have been abandoned without warning. And underneath all of it, I was scared to go back. I'm telling you this because honesty is the only thing I have left to be. I was scared because going back meant confronting Day, not violently, not yet, I didn't have that version of it assembled yet, but confronting the reality of what he had done and why, and I didn't have a container for that yet. I had only been surviving it. I hadn't started making sense of it. But I couldn't stay on a beach in a borrowed life indefinitely. No matter how much the borrowed life had started to feel, frighteningly, impossibly, like something I wanted to keep. I found Kale at the water. He went there in the morning sometimes, not fishing, just standing at the edge where the foam reached and retreated over his boots. He looked, at those moments, like a person in an argument with something that couldn't argue back. "I need to leave," I said. He didn't turn right away. The ocean was doing its morning thing, gulls and light and the particular smell of salt and distance. Then he turned and looked at me, and his face was careful. Professionally careful, the mask he reached for when something had surprised him. "I know," he said. "I have people who are probably—" "I know, Remy." His voice was even. "You have every reason to go. You should go." He said all the right things. He said them calmly and in the right order, and he walked with me back to the cabin and made breakfast, and we ate it and talked about nothing, and he was fine, he was completely fine. And then he wasn't. He started withdrawing around midday, not dramatically, not in any way I could point to a name cleanly. He just got quieter. More distant. He found things to do outside. By evening when I went in for dinner it was on the table, but he wasn't, and I sat and waited and ate alone, and the cabin felt like a different room than it had been all these weeks. Like someone had subtly rearranged it while I wasn't looking. He came in when I was nearly done. He sat. He ate the remainder of his portion in silence. I tried 3 conversational openings, and each of them foundered against the specific texture of his quiet, which was not his usual quiet, not the comfortable, inhabited silence, but something with a wall in it. I put my bowl down. Did I do something? No. Too quick. Kale. Go to sleep, Remy. You should rest before. Don't. I waited until he looked at me. I have every right to go home. We both know that. I'm not asking your permission. But I am asking you, directly, if I've done something to upset you, because I don't like sitting in a room with someone who's upset and pretending not to notice. He looked at me for a long moment. You haven't done anything, he said quietly. It's me. Go to sleep. He went out again. He came back after I was in the loft, and I heard him banking the fire and moving around below, and then it went quiet. I lay in the dark and thought about the particular injustice of having survived a drowning and an abandonment only to end up here, unable to sleep, worried about offending a man I'd known for 2 weeks. I thought, this is stupid. I am being stupid. I thought, he came into the water for you. Whatever his reasons. I thought, you are not going to fall in love with someone you met on an island. You are absolutely not going to do that. The ceiling said nothing helpful. He was there in the morning when I came down. Already at the table, not eating, just sitting with his hands around a cup of tea that had probably gone cold. He looked like he'd been up for hours. When I sat across from him, he said before I could speak, I owe you an apology. Kale? Let me. He set the cup down. He looked at the table, then at me, steady and direct. I had no right to behave like that last night. You've been nothing but, you've been completely reasonable. You have a life. You have people. You have every right to go back to them, and I spent yesterday being small about it in a way I'm not proud of. I looked at him. I wanted to ask you to stay, he said. That's the honest version. I wanted to ask you and I didn't because it's not a fair question and I knew that and I was angry with myself for wanting to ask it and I took that out on the space between us. I'm sorry. The quiet after that had weight. Why isn't it a fair question? I asked. He looked at me like I'd said something slightly impossible. Because you just almost died, he said. Because you came here destroyed and I put you back together and that creates a feeling of, it creates something that might not be real. I don't want to be something that happened to you while you were broken and have you mistake that for something it isn't. I kept my eyes on his face. What if I don't think it's a mistake? I said. He went very still. Come back with me, I said. My voice was embarrassingly steady considering what was happening in my chest. I'm not asking you to come back to everything. I'm not asking you to go back to whatever you left. I'm asking you to come somewhere with me. Somewhere quieter than the world and less far than this. We could make something. The two of us. I watched his face. I mean it. He was silent for a very long time. The ocean moved outside. I can't, he said finally, and it came out low and complicated, like a word that had cost him something to form. Before I could respond, before I could push or ask why or say any of the things queuing up behind my teeth, he went still in a different way, his attention suddenly at the window, and I followed his gaze. On the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a clean pale line, a shape had appeared. White, slick, expensive in a way visible even at this distance. A yacht. What? I put out a distress signal, he said. He was looking at the yacht with an expression I couldn't parse. Weeks ago. I didn't think, he stopped. I didn't think it would be like that. The yacht was enormous. The kind of vessel that announced itself. I looked at Kale. He was looking at the yacht like he was looking at something that had come from his own past to collect him. Kale. I kept my voice steady. What did you do before this? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Chapter 5. A Funeral for the Living. They treated me like I was made of something precious. Fresh clothes appeared, my size exactly, fine cotton, nothing I would have bought for myself. A private cabin with a bed that made Kale's good mattress feel like a rehearsal. 3 meals a day that arrived without my asking, each one calibrated somehow to be exactly what I wanted, which should have been mysterious but I was too overwhelmed to interrogate it. The crew was warm and discreet in equal measure and asked me almost nothing, which was either good hospitality or instruction from someone, and I knew enough now to suspect the latter. I sat on the deck the first evening and watched the water turn colors at sunset and thought about Kale standing on that beach watching me leave, and my chest did something architectural. Some load-bearing thing shifting out of position. I'll come back, I had said. I meant it. I still mean it, I told myself, because it was easy to mean it at sunset on a moving yacht. The real test was going to be everything waiting for me on shore. I had rehearsed it. The whole trip back I had run it through my head. The conversation with my sister first, then the calls I'd need to make, then eventually, because there was no avoiding it, what I would say. How I would say it. Whether I would start with "you left me in the ocean" or work up to it. I had built a careful structure and I walked into it and it fell apart immediately because the first person I saw was Day. He was on the street outside my building, of all the terrible coincidences, and he saw me before I saw him, and what happened to his face when he did, I have run this back so many times now trying to correctly identify what I saw. It was not pure relief. There was relief in it, yes. But there was something underneath the relief that moved too quickly. Some rapid recalibration, some math being done behind his eyes. Then it was gone and he was running toward me. Remy. He caught me by the arms and held me and he was shaking. Genuinely shaking. We searched for days. Days. The Coast Guard private searchers, I thought you were. His voice broke. I thought you were gone. I let him hold me. My body had done the arithmetic faster than my mind. Something is wrong, something is wrong, something is wrong. But he was shaking. He was shaking and his face was wet and 2 years and 4 months of history sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't put down, and I let him guide me inside. He got me through the lobby. Into the elevator. I remember thinking that it was strange he still had a key, that I should think about that, but I was jet-lagged and disoriented and the elevator was familiar and I let myself be guided by familiar things. He said he'd call my sister. He said he'd get me water. He said there was so much he needed to say. The apartment door closed. The lock turned. And then his hands were on my shoulders, not holding, gripping, and I was being moved backward through my own apartment, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who had just realized that a problem they thought was solved had walked back in through the front door. Day. How? He said quietly. Just that. Oh. Like I'd done something wrong by surviving. The basement door. I had not registered until this moment that there was a reason he knew where my building's basement access was, why he'd steered me here so smoothly, why this had the particular geometry of something that had been planned. The cold hit me like a second drowning. The door closed. The light was gone. Days, I think. 2 days, possibly 3, it was difficult to count in the dark. He brought water once. He said nothing when he did. His face in the flashlight beam was the face of someone doing something they had decided to finish and didn't want to discuss. I had time to think. That was the only thing the dark gave me. All that stripped, terrible time. And what I thought about, when I got past the fear and the cold and the animal panic of small spaces, was the inheritance. It had surfaced in my memory like something that had always been there, just submerged. My grandfather's estate, which I had filed somewhere in the back of my mind as a future Remy problem, with its specific clause that my lawyer had walked me through 2 years ago. Settled, partnered, the estate shared with the partner upon distribution. I had told Day about it once. Early in our relationship, offhandedly. I hadn't thought about it again. He had thought about it. He had thought about it and thought about it and done the math that I had never done because I had never needed to, because I was too busy being in love. He had thought about it until the math produced a boat trip and an open ocean and a body that would be found eventually by the current or not at all, and either outcome would serve. I sat in the dark and I understood. And understanding did not make it lighter, just like Kale had said. It made it exactly as heavy as it was. Just visible now. Something you could see the shape of in the dark. I thought about Kale on his beach. I thought, come back for me. I thought, please. What I didn't know, couldn't know, shivering in the basement of my own building, was that there was a man sitting in a cabin on a distant beach watching a hand-cranked radio with the same focused attention most people reserve for things they cannot afford to misunderstand. He was waiting for my name in the news. After 4 days he stopped waiting. He packed one bag. He made a call. Chapter 6, The Man with One Bag. The light came on at 4 in the morning. Not my phone's light, I had no phone. Not a flashlight. The full overhead bulb of the basement corridor flooding in through the blown open door and voices and boots on the floor and then Kale. He was in the doorway. He had a bag over one shoulder and he was wearing the jacket from the beach and he looked wrong in the corridor's fluorescent light, too large and too solid and too real, and his eyes found me immediately across the room and stayed there. Hi, I said. My voice sounded like something that had been stored badly. He crossed the room in 3 strides and crouched in front of me and put one hand on the side of my face, not roughly, just checking. Mapping. A quick, thorough inventory of damage. Can you walk? Yes. Then let's walk. I didn't get the full picture until I was in the back of a car with a blanket around me and a paramedic doing quiet, thorough things and Kale sitting across from me with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose and his expression wearing the particular blankness of someone managing something very large very quietly. There were police. There was a legal team that seemed to materialize fully assembled within 20 minutes of our departure from the basement. There were, it emerged, recordings, from the building's lobby camera, from Day's devices, from financial records that had been forensically compiled in the past 4 days by people who apparently did nothing else. How? I said. Kale looked at me. The yacht, he said. The crew contacted me when they got you home safely. I was expecting you back in the public, A social post, a news story, your sister saying something. Nothing came. He paused. I know what that silence means. How do you know what that silence means? He looked at the window. I had people look into it, he said. Your inheritance. The estate clause. Day's financial position, which is catastrophic, has been for over a year. The boat's charter records, the crew manifest, the payment trail. He said it all flatly, like reading from a document. It assembled quickly once someone was looking. You had people. Yes. Kale. I waited until he looked at me. Who are you? He was quiet for a moment. Someone who should have told you more weeks ago, he said. And didn't? Because telling you would have meant explaining why I was on that beach, and that was a conversation I wasn't. He stopped. I wasn't ready for. Tell me now. He looked out the window at the city going past, which he was absorbing with the slight tension body language of someone returning to something they'd armored themselves against. My name is Kale Sue, he said. I used to run a company. Several, technically, at peak. Infrastructure technology, some clean energy, some development. I was 28 when the first one made serious money and 31 when the portfolio became the kind of thing that changes how people see you. Pause. How everyone sees you. People who loved you. People you trusted. The way they start to manage you. Position themselves. I stopped being able to tell the difference between someone being in a room with me because they wanted to be there and someone being in a room with me because of what being in a room with me was worth to them. He was still looking out the window. And then something specific happened, he said quieter. And I decided I was finished. What specific thing? He turned and looked at me. Someone I loved, he said simply. Left me somewhere. Metaphorically. The quiet in the car was the kind that changes the air pressure slightly. I'm sorry, I said. So am I. He turned back to the window. I went to the beach. I was finished with people, I thought. I thought I could just be finished with them and that would be sufficient and eventually it would feel like a choice rather than a wound. And then you washed up on my beach and ruined the entire plan. I looked at him. He was almost, not quite but almost, smiling. Day was arrested at 6 in the morning. I was not present for it and I'm glad of that. I've been told it was unremarkable. He didn't run, didn't fight, just went very still when they came in and looked at the floor. I didn't feel what I had expected to feel when they told me. Not relief exactly. Something less clean than relief. Something that had splinters in it. My sister arrived at the hospital at 7. She held me for a very long time and said nothing, and that was the right thing to say. She had clearly been crying for days and was now redirecting all of that energy into pointed, furious efficiency, which was deeply her. At some point she noticed Kale, who was in the waiting room with his one bag, sitting with the specific patience of someone who has decided to wait as long as it takes. She looked at me. Who is that? That, I said, is a very long story. He hasn't moved in 3 hours. I know. She looked at him again. At me. Okay, she said in a tone that meant she had collected several opinions and was choosing to defer them strategically. The legal process was going to take time. That was clear. The inheritance claim Day had begun to file was frozen. The boat crew being interviewed, the forensic financial trail being formally documented. I would be needed. I would be asked questions and required to be present in rooms I didn't want to be in. All of that was coming. But it was coming. It had a shape. It was not the shapeless dark of not understanding. Late that afternoon, when the hospital had finished with me and my sister had been dispatched home with promises, I found Kale where I'd left him. Still in the waiting room. Bag on the floor beside his chair. Reading nothing, doing nothing, simply waiting. I sat beside him. You came, I said. You said you'd come back, he said. Seemed uneven to make you do all the work. I looked at the middle distance. I want to ask you something, I said. All right. The offer you made. On the beach. You said, I stopped. You said you'd go anywhere. With me. If I still wanted. He turned to look at me. I said that, he confirmed. Did you mean it? The waiting room hummed its institutional hum. Down the corridor someone's family was receiving news of some kind, their voices traveling as sound without words. The world was doing what it always did. Running, uninterrupted, around the people inside it trying to make the most consequential decisions of their lives. Yes, said Kale. Steady as a floor. I meant it. But there was still the question I hadn't asked. The one that sat between us like a third person in the room. Why he had really left. What the specific thing was that had sent a billionaire to the edge of the world with one bag and no forwarding address. And whether whatever it was could reach us. Whether it already had. Chapter 7. Somewhere quiet. We didn't leave immediately. The world required things from me first. Formal statements, court appearances, the exhausting bureaucratic machinery that surrounds a crime when the crime is documented and provable and moving toward consequence. I gave them what they needed. I sat in rooms and answered questions and signed things, and the inheritance proceedings were untangled and resolved, and Day's face across a courtroom was exactly what I had expected and somehow still cost me something. I won't lie, there were days I struggled. Days when the understanding, now clean and fully assembled, sat in my chest like a swallowed stone and I couldn't eat around it. My therapist, who I found in the second week back, told me this was normal. That betrayal of that magnitude has a physiological component, that my body was processing something the mind was still trying to categorize. I told her about Kale. She didn't say much. She asked good questions and let me answer them. On the third session she said, "It sounds like he showed up for you in both directions." "What does that mean?" "He pulled you out of the water," she said. "And then he came back through the water to find you. That's not a complicated set of data, Remy. The complication is whether you trust the data." Kale was patient in ways I don't have adequate language for. He stayed in the city. He rented something unremarkable near my apartment and he was available when I needed him and absent when I needed space, and he navigated this somehow without ever making me feel managed or watched, which I later learned was a skill he had spent a long time developing in the opposite direction, learning to recognize when people he trusted were managing him. He told me in pieces, over evenings that got longer as the weeks passed. The company he'd built. The partner, a word he used deliberately meaning both business and personal, since those two things had become too entangled to separate, who had leveraged his trust and his resources into something Kale hadn't discovered until it was already done, cleanly, with the specific cruelty of something that had been planned far in advance. He knew what I was worth, Kale said. One evening. At my kitchen table. He said it without weight, just as information, but I heard the ghost of the old weight underneath it. Before he knew anything else about me. That was always the first thing. "That's not what you are," I said. He looked at me. "You're not what you're worth," I said. "You're not a number. You never were." And whatever he did to make you believe otherwise, I stopped because he was looking at me with an expression that made the sentence feel too fragile to finish. "I know," he said finally. Quietly. "It took a beach in 2 years and a very stubborn designer who can't operate a fishing rod, but I know." I threw a dish towel at him. He caught it without looking. The place we chose took 3 weeks to find. We both knew what we were looking for, or rather, we each knew half of it and it turned out the halves fit. I needed to be near enough to a city to work, to see my sister, to exist in the world in the ways I had chosen to exist in it. He needed room and quiet and a version of life that wasn't defined by what his name meant to other people. We found a house on a cape. Stone and old wood and windows that faced the ocean, because apparently neither of us had been cured of the ocean by almost dying in it, which my therapist said was noteworthy and probably healthy. An hour's drive from the city. A garden that had been neglected and needed something from us. The first night we were there we sat on the steps outside and looked at the water. It was quiet in the right way. The inhabited way. "Tell me something," I said. "Specific request or general?" "General. Something I don't know." He thought about it. "The first time I noticed you noticing things," he said. "The very first time, you'd been awake maybe a day and a half and you were sitting up in the cot and you were looking at the way the firelight moved on the wall. And there's this thing you do when you're thinking about how something would look drawn. Your eyes go to slightly different things than other people's eyes go to. The shadows instead of the light. The edges." He paused. "I noticed that." I looked at him. "That first day. I was trying not to," he said. "To be clear. I was trying very hard not to notice anything. Not successful. Comprehensively not successful." I leaned into him. His arm went around me, not tentatively but the way you do something that already belongs in the category of automatic, and we sat there while the ocean did its evening thing, that westward pull he told me about in the early days, and the sky went from gold to rose to the deep unhurried blue that arrives just before dark. "Kale. I want you to know something." "All right." I looked at the water. At the way the last light caught it and made it look briefly like something else, something that didn't have the word drowning in it. When I sank, I said, in the ocean. The last thought I had was I don't understand. Not about dying. About day. About why. I paused. And I want you to know that I understand now. Not him, I may never fully understand him and I've made peace with that. But I understand what happened to me and why, and more than that, I stopped. Steadied. I understand why it had to happen the way it did. Because if it hadn't, I would have been on a different boat my whole life. One that was leaving me the whole time, and I was too busy being grateful for the view to notice. His arm tightened slightly. And I understand what the ocean gave me, I said. When I finally stopped fighting it. The quiet after that was the best kind of quiet. The kind with a future in it. There is a drawing on the wall of the stone house. I made it in the first month from memory with charcoal on thick paper. A fire in a one-room cabin, the light moving on the wood, a large man with his back to the viewer stirring a pot. Kale pretends to find it embarrassing. He hung it himself. The garden needed work all through the first spring and we gave it what it needed. Time and attention and showing up for it consistently even when it didn't show us anything back. By the third month it had started to return what we put in. My therapist said that was probably not a coincidence as a metaphor.